So hi everyone, welcome to today's free LSAT prep hour. I'm going to give maybe another minute for those who are just signing in, and then we'll get started. Okay, so let's go ahead and start. Welcome to tonight's free LSAT prep hour. I'm Misty. We're going to be talking about logic games tonight, specifically about the process for handling the most common questions that you'll see on logic games. Before we start talking specifically about the games, I want to note that there are some more free resources on our website that you should take advantage of. Also, logistics for tonight. Everybody is off camera and off mic except me. I'll ask you to please chat into me if you have questions. And you can also chat into me answers when I ask for them. If you have any questions as we go along that come up, please just chat them into me. Just be a little patient when and give me a minute or two to respond. It's hard for me to chat and talk at the same time. All right, so here's what we're going to cover. Like I said, we're going to focus on logic games, and we're going to focus on how to do the most common types of questions that you'll see on the games. And what's most important here, I think, is making sure that you have a good process for every logic games question. And that process should always be, number one, what type of question is it? And number two, what is the question asking? And I think it's really important to break these down into step one, step two, especially when you're first learning. I see a lot of students try to do everything at the same time, and you might absolutely have conditional questions down. But then if you don't take a second to make sure that you also know what the question is asking, it's really easy to get tripped up by a could be true question that you do as a must be true question, or vice versa. And if you approach the questions like this, step one, what type of question? Step two, what is the question asking? It becomes ingrained. And then as you start to go faster on the games, you're still doing the same thing. You're doing it really quickly, but it's much less likely that you'll miss something. So tonight we're going to talk about the three most common types of questions, which are conditional, unconditional, and orientation. These are not the only types of questions that you'll see on the games. There are other types, and even though they're less common, you will see them. And they're in the beautifully named category, something else. We're not going to get into them tonight because these three really are the foundation. And the other types of questions are questions that you should hit and practice on your own. But I want to focus on the foundations tonight. And then same thing, could be true, must be false are the most common things that especially conditional and unconditional questions will ask you. And then we also have this very nebulous category of something else, which usually comes up with a different type of question, or occasionally you might get a could be false question. But the most common are must be true, could be true, and must be false. And again, we're going to focus on the basics tonight, so we're going to focus on those. Any questions about anything so far? Again, put any questions into chat. Okay. So what we're going to do is go through a game and then some conditional, unconditional, and orientation questions. So step one is going to be to set up a game. Here is your game. It's PT65 Game 4. If this is a little bit hard to read, you can also use your own copy of it. That's fine. And I want you to take 3 minutes to read the setup, diagram it however makes sense to you, and then we'll go from there. So you can take 30 more seconds to set this up. Okay. So go ahead and wrap up there. And let's take a minute to talk about this setup. It's kind of a tricky one. Chat into me what you found challenging about this setup or what you most want to talk about. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and note the way I did this setup. I think there are a few possible ways to do it, and you might have something a little bit different, but this is the way that it makes the most sense to me. One of the things that's tricky about this is the G, because the G is going to be for a full hour, meaning it's going to take up 2 slots. So I'm going to do this with the G. Technically, there's only one G, but since it's taking up an hour, it's taking up 2 spots. And that's a little bit easier for me to remember that it's going to take both spots. And then for the first rule that it starts on the hour, I mean, you could just write that it starts on the hour, but it might be helpful to break it down a little bit here because you only have 3 on the hour options. So either it's going to be 1, 2, or 3. And there's really not any other option there. For T, that one is a little bit more open. So I'm just going to say that T is going to be on a half hour for now. Third rule, R is going to be before S. Straightforward enough. And then the last one, I'm going to adjust a little bit as well, because if you just straight diagram that rule, it's going to look like this. If W is before T, then W is immediately before T. But this is an ordering game and there's only one spot. There are not multiple spots or multiple options in each spot. It's not like 2 on the 330, for example. So either W's before T or W's after T. And this is going to be a lot easier to deal with if we diagram it like this, because if W is before T, it's got to be immediately before. That's the only option. And then if it's after T, then it's after T. Means the same thing, but I'm just putting a little bit more information in there to make it easier to use when we go through the game. So there's a question in the chat about what does GG mean? Like I said, when I was setting it up, the GG is representing that the G takes up an entire hour. So I just made it GG to make it a little bit easier for myself to remember that it's going to take up 2 slots. And again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. That's a little bit easier for me to deal with or to read and type at the same time. And then I also want to note, because of this R before S, at least we know S can't be first and R can't be last. Does anyone have any questions about this, or did anyone do it radically differently? So we know that G is going to be on for a full hour because of what we see in the setup here. So it says G is going to be hour long, and then the rest of them are only going to be a half an hour long. So R before S means that S can't be first, which is what I've noted here, because if R has to come before it, if S is first, there's no room for R to come before it. And then the same with R last. If S has to be after, or if S has to be after R, then R can't be last because then there's no room for S to come after. Yeah, you could just write out the hour for G and the half hour for the rest of them, but I like to make it part of the rules that I can see really quickly if it's possible to do that. All right. So that's a good question about T. And yes, we can say that T can't go in 1, 2, or 3. And if you want to write that out, you can do that as well. I might not, just because I have the rule that T has to be on the half hour. So I'm going to be paying attention to that as I go along. But this is totally correct. And if it makes it a little bit easier, you can go ahead and throw those T antes in there. The question about T was, could we say that T can't go in 1, 2, and 3? And the answer is yes, we do know that. I just didn't put it in the diagram because I had it in the rules, but it's totally fair to put it in the diagram. Did anyone try to frame this? So framing just means making more than one diagram. And that's a little bit of Manhattan Prep lingo. I'll show you what it means here. Sometimes you can see something like a division in the games where you have a rule or an element that can only go in maybe 2 or 3 places. And if that rule or element narrows other options as well, it can be helpful to break down those possibilities. This one is a little bit of a judgment call. So GG here for my representation of the 1 hour G, because it has to start on the hour, can only go in 1, 2, and 3. So if you were to frame that, it would look like this. Now, whether or not this is useful and worth your time at the beginning usually has to do with how limited that specific element is. So G is not in any other rules. So it's not going to lock down a whole lot here. But we do have another element that's kind of limited, which is T. So if, for example, in this first frame, G is taking 1 and 130, then the only options for T are going to be 230 or 330. If G is taking up 2 and 230, the only options for T are going to be 130 and 330. And if G is taking up 3 and 330, the only options for T are going to be 130 and 230. So that gives us a little bit more of a limit. There's really not a whole lot else we know here for sure, because the W is going to depend on where the T is, and then also maybe how variable it is, because if the T is in the beginning or in the middle here, W could be before or after. And then we'll kind of put R and S where we have room when it's left. So I might on test day just note the 1, 2, and 3, and then work out the rest of it on the questions. But I also think it would be totally fair to make these frames because it's a little bit more helpful to see exactly where your G is going to go. So there's a question about whether we will receive a recording of the Zoom meeting. This webinar is recorded and is put on YouTube probably in a week or two. All right, any other questions about the setup? All right. Make sure you keep your own notes about the setup as well. I'll redo it for the questions, but I'm not going to redo the diagramming of every single rule. I'll just redo the number line as we work out the questions. All right. The first thing we're going to talk about is conditional questions. Take a second to read over this slide, and then I'm going to note a couple of things. So conditional questions, I think, are the best questions in logic games because they always give you a new condition, if whatever, and that means it gives you a place to start. These are really good for building up hypotheticals. So we'll see what that looks like. It can give you what we call previous work, some possible ways the game works out, and you can often use that for other questions. Sometimes too, if I'm not feeling super sure about a game, if there's something I don't 100% understand, starting with the conditional questions can be really helpful because it gives a place to start and helps me figure out the game. The most important things here are one, make sure you make a new mini diagram for conditional questions. If it's an ordering game, that just means make a new number line. If it is a grouping game, you'll make a new version of whatever the grouping diagram is. It can be pretty basic. You don't have to redraw all the rules, for example. You just want to have the diagram so that you have room to put in the condition plus everything that has to be true based on that condition. And what we're going to try and do is fill the diagram out as much as we possibly can, because a lot of times with conditional questions, once you fill out the diagram, you can go straight to the answer, and then it can save you time testing. Plus, it builds up work that you can use on other questions. Any questions about this? And then once you know it's a conditional question, second part to note, what is the question asking? And again, most common things that a conditional question will ask you are must be true, could be true, or could be true except, and could be true except means must be false. Sometimes it'll also ask you what cannot be true, also must be false. All right, so let's try this on a question. Go ahead and work this out and chat your answer in when you have it so I know you're done. So if you have an answer, chat it in. If not, go ahead and take a guess. And you should always guess on the LSAT if you're not sure. There's no penalty for wrong answers. And if you take a guess, at least you got a shot. Don't leave anything blank. Okay. So step one, what type of question is it? Starts with an if, so it's a conditional question. Step two, what is the question asking us? Question is asking what must be true, which means we got to be careful about answers that could be true but don't have to be true. And we got to try and make sure that we get an answer that absolutely has to be true. So our condition here is that S is the third program. And this is where that double G is going to be kind of a pain because there are two options for S as the third program. It could be that the double G is the first program. So that's going to be 1 and 130, meaning that S would have to be the third program at 230. But that's not the only option because we could also have 2 half-hour programs coming first and second. So then S could be the third program at 2 o'clock, which would push the double G to 3 and 3:30. And since this is a must be true question, we're going to have to work out both of these options because otherwise it's very likely that you'll fall into the trap of an answer that could be true, but doesn't have to be true. So with this first frame, S at 2:30, next most limited element is T because T has to go on a half an hour. There's only 1 half an hour left. So T has got to be at 3:30. W is now forced to be before T, which means it's got to be at 3, which is going to put R at 2. Also, too, especially since these answers are talking about first program, second program, fifth program, I'm going to make this little slashies here to help me see which program is like first, second, third, fourth. So now GG is our first program, R second, S is third, W is fourth, T is fifth. And then with the top one, if S is at 2:30 or S is at 2, we now have a couple of options for T in theory. So we could put T at 2:30, except everything after T is already taken, which means that W has to be before T, which means W has to be immediately before T. So this is going to be kind of an issue. The other option is to put T here at 1:30, which at least gives us a little bit more wiggle room for the W, because if R is before S, R is going to have to go here, but then we can put W here, and that's still okay. And now we've got first program, second program, third program, fourth program, fifth program. And then for a must be true question, when I made these two frames, I'm looking for what has to be true in both of them. What has to be true in both of them? W is the fourth program. Questions about this? Okay. All right, so I'm going to take advantage of the fact that this was a conditional question and leave the work here. When you're doing this on test day, you should leave your work on your paper. Don't erase. That way you can use it on future questions. So let's do one more conditional question. Go ahead and do this one. Chat your answer in when you have it. If you have an answer, chat it in. If not, go ahead and take a guess. So we've got another question that starts with an if. So we know it's a conditional question. Step 2, what is the question asking? This one's asking what could be true. So for this one, we don't have to have an answer that has to be true every single time with this condition. Just a question that could, or an answer that could be possible with this condition. And I'm actually going to go through this the way that I did it earlier today, which was probably the least efficient way to do it, just to show you what it looks like, because sometimes you guess wrong on these. So if G is going to be the third program, then the GG is going to take the 2 and 2:30 slot, which means all the other half an hours are broken up. And next place we go is to T. T can either go 1:30 or 3:30. Since this is a could be true question, I'm not going to work out all the possibilities first, the way that I did with a must be true question, because if I work out a possibility and there's an answer that reflects it, then I'm done and I don't have to keep working. So the way I did this earlier today is I started with T here. And then I put W and 1, and then R and S and 3 and 3:30. and then went up and scanned the answers, no answers. So then, okay, that happens sometimes. So I'm going to work out another frame. And this time I put T here at 3:30. So W is before it, and then R and S, basically flipping the first frame. Again, no answers. And then I took about 30 seconds to think if I was going absolutely insane and had lost it. And then I realized there was one more possibility. And unlucky for me, I picked the first two possibilities that didn't have answers. But I'm going to keep this work because it might be useful on other questions. And I would still recommend going through it like this because I think it's a little bit easier. The last possibility that I didn't try was what if T is at 1:30 and W is after it? So that's going to put W at 3 or 3:30. Doesn't matter. I'll just kind of throw it out here. But then because R has to be before S, R is going to be first. And then S and W are interchangeable here because it doesn't really matter which one's which. And now I've got an answer. S can be fourth. Questions about this? Okay. So now let's talk about unconditional questions. And I'm going to try and leave this work on the slide, but if it makes the next slide unreadable, then I'll redraw it when we get to the unconditional question. And of course, it does make the slide unreadable. Well, I'll get rid of some of it anyway. All right. Take a second to read over this slide, and then I'll highlight a few things here as well. So an unconditional question is a question that just asks you something about the whole game. What must be true, what could be true, what must be false usually. The problem with these is that they can take a lot of time, especially if you just dive right into testing. And I see a lot of students just jump right into testing these without thinking about faster ways to do them. The first thing that you should always check if you have an unconditional question that is a must be question. So if it's a must be true question or a must be false question, check your inferences. Because the answer to a must be question is always an inference. So if you have an inference, you might have already answered the questions. And if it's a game where you have inferences and you have them, pretty neatly organized where you can see them, scan the inferences first and see if you have an answer to the question. Now, if you don't have an answer to the question, that's okay. That doesn't mean that you've made a huge mistake on the game or on the inferences. Some inferences are just extremely difficult to see up front, and that's fine. The next thing that you should do is use previous work. And that's why we're keeping the work from those first two conditional questions. Especially for a harder game, if I don't have a lot of inferences, I will do all of the conditional questions first, get as much work as I can, and then come back to do the unconditional questions. That way I don't have to test out the unconditional questions. Or at least, hopefully, I can eliminate a few answers and not have to test out as much. And then the last thing to do here is test answers if you need to. It's not the end of the world. And if you are looking at a question and your previous work isn't answering it, or you don't have the inferences for it, or it's a could be question and your previous work isn't answering it, then it's best to just start testing. That's okay. You just want to try and take advantage of inferences and previous work if you have them, and not be in the habit of testing these questions automatically, because you can't test all of them. All right. Any questions about this? Okay. So now let's do an unconditional question. And as you're working it out, I will put the previous work back on the slide. Remember as well that for unconditional questions, they most commonly ask what could be true, what must be true, what could be true, or what must be false. All right, so here's your question. Chat your answer in when you have it. If you have an answer, chat it in. If not, go ahead and take a guess. So we know that it's an unconditional question. There's no condition. It's just asking about the game. Second step, what is the question asking? It's asking what cannot be true, i.e. what must be false. And since I don't have a lot of inferences for this game, they're just a couple of smaller ones, I would probably just go ahead and go into the answers because I do have a lot of previous work. And this question is asking what must be false. So if we have an example where we have the answer in previous work and it was okay, we made it work, then it's not something that has to be false. So A, S is before G. So I'm going to scan the previous work to see if there's an example of S before G, which there is here. So that's fine. It does not have to be false. I'm going to leave it. B, W is before R. I don't have W before R, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the answer. It could just be that I haven't worked it out. So I don't want to pick it. I'm just going to keep moving and hold it. C, G is before S. G could be before S here because these S and W are interchangeable. So we get rid of C. R is before T. Yeah, got R is before T. And then T is before W. I also don't have T as before W. So now we've eliminated 3 answers. And I don't have to go back and try and test all of the answers. Which one do I have in 21? R before T or something else? So what it says is W immediately before R. So be careful about that. Because I do have W before R in 21, but I don't have W right before R. So we got to be really careful about that wording. And then there's also a question about whether or not E violates a rule. E does not violate a rule. Because remember, that rule is if W is before T, then it has to be WT. But the other option is that T could be before W. And there's no limit on that. So it could possibly be T right before W. I don't know. I'm going to have to test it out, but it doesn't automatically violate a rule. Be careful too on questions like this if you think an answer violates a rule, because usually that's not the case. That makes it a little bit too easy. All right. And since we just talked about E, and also I think E is probably a little bit more likely to work because I can't really see why it wouldn't, at least on a quick glance. I'm going to test out E because that seems a little bit easier. So I'll just put T the first place it can go, which means W would be in 2. That'll push the GG to 3 and 330. And then RS, that's fine. So B is the answer. Questions about this? Okay. And then the last type of question we're going to do is an orientation question. So take a minute to read this. So with orientation questions, you have a couple of options. Orientation questions are almost always the first question in a game. And if you do the questions in order or you do the orientation question first, you want to make sure you write down the answer to that question because that'll be your first example of previous work and you can use it for later questions the way that we just used the previous work on the question we just did. I personally find orientation questions a little bit annoying, especially if I'm not 100% sure about how a game works. So sometimes I do them last. That's really, again, a little bit of a matter of personal preference. And if you do them last, you don't get the previous work for them. But I find it a little bit annoying sometimes because you have to dig through the rules so much. And for orientation questions, we're just going to use the rules to eliminate and pick the answer that's left. So go through the rules one at a time and then eliminate an answer that violates that rule. Go to the next rule, eliminate an answer that violates that rule, and then pick what's left. And here's your question. Chat your answer in when you have it. If you have an answer, chat it in. If not, go ahead and take a guess. And I'm sorry, this would have been a little bit easier, at least for the slide, if I had copied the rules over to the slide as well, but I did not. So you have to use the rules on your own copy. And then I'll also read them off as I go. All right. So the first rule was that G has to be on the hour. So that seems good for A. 1, 1:30, 2, 2:30, 3, good for B. 1, 1:30, 2, 2:30, that's a problem for C. Next rule, T has to be on the half an hour. So 1, 2, 2:30, 3, that's a problem for T. Next rule was that R is before S. R before S, R before S, R after S. That's a problem for E. And then the last rule is that either W is immediately before T or T is after W. So here, W is before and it's immediately before. But in D, W is before T, but it's not immediately before T. So B is the answer. Questions about this? Okay. And this is a recap of the process that we talked about. Most important thing here for every logic games question. What type of question is it? What is the question asking? Always ask yourself those two things. Again, we went through the most common question types and the most common things that questions will ask for those question types. But even if it's another question type, what type of question is it? What is the question asking? Any last questions about anything we talked about tonight? Okay. So that's a wrap. Reminder to check our website for any other free resources, and have a good night, everyone.